The last letter arrived on a morning thick with fog, carried by a messenger who would not come closer than the garden gate. Inside the wax-sealed envelope, my sister's handwriting trembled across the page, each word a small miracle of survival. She had lived. Against all odds, through the worst of it, she had lived. And now, slowly, carefully, she was learning how to exist in a world that had forgotten how to be whole. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you'd like, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The plague had come to our village in late autumn, when the leaves were already falling and the world seemed to be preparing for sleep. We thought in our innocence that winter would protect us. Cold, we believed, would kill the contagion. We were wrong about so many things in those days. The sickness moved through our streets like smoke, invisible and unstoppable, slipping under doors and through shuttered windows, finding its way into homes where families huddled together for warmth, which only hastened its spread. My sister Elena lived 3 villages away, married to a wool merchant who traveled the roads between market towns. When the sickness came, the roads closed. Messages stopped. For 8 months I heard nothing. 8 months of silence so complete it felt like death itself. I tried not to imagine. I failed constantly. Every night I saw her face, pale and fevered. Every morning I woke, believing she was gone. But she wrote. When the roads finally opened and messengers began moving again, carefully, fearfully, avoiding contact, leaving letters at gates and boundary stones, she wrote. Her first letter was brief. I am alive, it said. Nothing more, just those 3 words and her name. I held that paper and wept for an hour. The second letter came a week later, longer this time. She told me about the early days when the first cases appeared in her town, a family of cloth merchants who had come from the south. Within days, half the household was sick. Within 2 weeks, they were all dead, and the sickness had spread to 6 neighboring houses. The town elders ordered the streets cleared. Anyone showing signs of fever was to be removed immediately to the pest house outside the walls. Elena wrote about watching her neighbors carried away on carts, most of them never to return. She wrote about the silence that fell over the town as people stopped visiting each other, stopped gathering, stopped living in all the ways that made life bearable. Markets closed. The church locked its doors. Even the taverns, those stubborn holdouts against every misery, finally shuttered their windows and sent their patrons home. Her husband fell ill in the 2nd month. She described his fever, the way it climbed and climbed until he barely knew her. She sat beside his bed for 6 days, cooling his forehead with wet cloths, forcing water between his cracked lips, praying to every saint she could name. On the 7th day, the fever broke. He lived. So few lived. She wrote about the gratitude and the guilt that came with his survival, the way she could barely look at her neighbors afterward, knowing that their loved ones had not been so fortunate. I began writing back, long letters that I sent with messengers who would take them as far as the next town, where other messengers would carry them forward. It took weeks for letters to travel distances that had once taken 2 days on horseback. But we wrote anyway. What else could we do? We were survivors in a world of ghosts, and words were the only bridges left between us. In my letters I told Elena about our village. We had been lucky if such a word could be used for any part of that time. The sickness came late to us, and less severely. We lost perhaps a quarter of our people, which felt like a mercy when we heard stories from other places where 3/4 had died or more. Old Thomas the blacksmith survived, though his wife and 2 sons did not. Young Catherine lost her parents but saved her 3 younger siblings through sheer force of will, nursing them all through the fever when she was barely 15 years old. I told my sister about the changes we were seeing, how the fields lay partly untended because there were not enough hands to work them, how the harvest that year was small and strange, gathered by whoever remained, regardless of whose land it had been. Property rights seemed to matter less when so many properties had no owners left to claim them. The manor lord tried to maintain order, tried to insist that the old arrangements held, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. Half his household was dead. His bailiff had fled. The world we had known was simply gone. Elena's letters grew longer as the months passed, more detailed, more reflective. She wrote about the morning she finally left her house after weeks of isolation. The streets were nearly empty, but not quite. Here and there, other survivors emerged, blinking in the sunlight like creatures from underground. They did not speak to each other at first. They moved carefully, keeping distance, eyes down. Trust had died along with so much else. But slowly, carefully, connections began to reform. A woman Elena knew slightly from the market nodded to her from across the street. The next day, they stood at a distance and spoke briefly about the weather. The day after that, the conversation lasted longer. Within a week, they were meeting each morning, still keeping space between them, still wary, but talking. About small things at first. The price of bread, though there was little bread to be had. The state of the roads, whether the spring would come early. Then gradually about larger things. About who had died, about who had lived, about what they would do now, in this world that had become unfamiliar and strange. The woman, whose name was Margaret, had lost her husband and 2 children. Elena had lost friends, neighbors, the fabric of daily life she had taken for granted. They shared their losses carefully, like people sharing food during a famine, parceling out their grief in measures they could bear. In my village, similar patterns emerged. We came back together slowly, testing the air, seeing if community could exist again. The first gathering was a funeral, which seemed fitting. We buried old Johann the carpenter, who had survived the plague only to die of a weak heart 3 months later. Perhaps 24 of us stood around his grave, more people together in one place than had gathered in half a year. We were nervous. We stood apart from each other. But we were there. After the funeral, we lingered. No one seemed ready to return to their empty houses. Someone suggested we meet again, perhaps once a week, just to see each other, to remember we were not alone. The meetings started small. 5 or 6 people in the church courtyard, standing in a circle, talking about nothing in particular. But the circle grew. After a few weeks, 12 people came, then 20. We were rebuilding something, though we could not have said exactly what. Elena wrote about the first market that opened in her town months after the plague had passed. The merchants were few and their goods were scarce, but they came. People emerged from their houses with what little money they had and wandered between the stalls, touching fabrics, examining tools, engaging in the ancient ritual of commerce. It felt almost normal, except for the absences. The stalls that stood empty because their owners were dead, the customers who would never come again, the prices which had climbed terrifyingly high because there was so little of everything and so few people to make more. Her husband's wool business had survived, barely. Many of his contacts were dead, his regular routes disrupted, but he had goods and there was demand. Desperate demand. People needed cloth for clothing, for blankets, for burial shrouds. He began traveling again, carefully avoiding towns where sickness was still reported, dealing only with people who appeared healthy, taking every precaution he could think of. Elena did not want him to go. She had nearly lost him once and could not bear the thought of risking him again. But they needed income. Their savings had dwindled. The world had changed, but people still needed to eat, and eating required money. So he went, and she stayed home and worried. And when he returned safely each time, she felt the guilt again, grateful for her fortune, haunted by the faces of those who had not been so lucky. I understood her guilt. I felt it myself every time I walked through our village and saw the empty houses. The miller's cottage stood abandoned, its garden overgrown. The family was entirely gone, all 7 of them, within a span of 10 days. Young Peter had been my age. We had played together as children, worked in the fields together as adults. Now his house was a tomb of possessions no one wanted to claim, as if the sickness might still linger in the blankets and tools and pots. Some houses were occupied again, but by strangers. People had moved, fleeing places where the plague had been worse, looking for opportunities in places where death had created vacancies. A family from 2 valleys over took the miller's house. I tried to welcome them, but it felt wrong. They slept in beds that had held the dying. They cooked at a hearth where a family had gathered for their last meals together. How could life simply continue like that, as if the previous occupants had never existed? But it did continue. That was the strange, uncomfortable truth we all had to learn. Life went on. It had to. The fields needed planting. Children needed feeding. Roofs needed mending. We could mourn, and we did, but we also had to work. The dead were dead, and the living needed to live. And somehow those two facts had to coexist in our hearts and minds. Elena's letters became my anchor through those months. Her words arrived irregularly, sometimes 2 letters in a week when a messenger made good time, sometimes nothing for a month when roads were impassable or carriers refused certain routes. But each letter was a treasure. She wrote about the small victories of survival, the first meal she cooked that tasted like something worth eating, the first time she laughed at something, then immediately felt ashamed for laughing, the first morning she woke without immediately counting the dead. She also wrote about the changes in her town's social fabric. The old hierarchies had not disappeared, but they had loosened. There were not enough servants to maintain grand households, so merchants' wives found themselves cooking their own meals. There were not enough laborers to work the fields on old terms, so wages rose sharply, and landowners who had once dictated conditions now found themselves negotiating. The world was being remade, not through revolution, but through absence. Where people had been, there was now nothing, and into that nothing, new arrangements flowed. Some of the changes were beneficial. A young woman named Alice, who had worked as a servant in Elena's household before the plague, now owned a small shop. Her employer had died without heirs, and in the chaos that followed, Alice had simply taken possession of the business. No one challenged her. There was no one left to challenge her. She sold dry goods and did well enough to support herself and her elderly mother. In the old world, this would have been impossible. In the new world, it was merely unusual. Other changes were harder to categorize. The church struggled to maintain its authority when so many priests had died. In Elena's town, the parish priest had succumbed in the first wave of sickness. His replacement, a young man barely past his ordination, seemed overwhelmed by the scope of loss his congregation had suffered. He gave sermons about God's will and divine punishment, but the words rang hollow. People came to church from habit, but their faith had been tested in ways that platitudes could not address. Some lost their faith entirely. Elena wrote about a man named Thomas who had been devout before the plague, attending Mass daily, fasting rigorously, giving generously to the church. He had prayed ceaselessly when his children fell ill. All 3 died within a week. Now he wanted nothing to do with religion. He would spit when he passed the church. "What God allows this?" he would say to anyone who would listen. "What God worthy of worship?" Others clung to faith more tightly. If God had permitted this suffering, they reasoned, it must be for a purpose beyond human understanding. They must be faithful. They must be worthy. They must earn divine mercy through devotion. These people attended every service, gave beyond their means, wore their piety like armor against further loss. Elena fell somewhere between these extremes. She believed, she wrote, but differently than before. Her faith had been simple once, a set of certainties absorbed from childhood. Now it was complicated, full of questions she could not answer. Why had her husband lived when so many others died? Why had some families been spared while others were entirely destroyed? If this was divine punishment, what had they done to deserve it? And if it wasn't punishment, if it was merely random catastrophe, what did that say about the universe they inhabited? I had my own questions. In my village, the pattern of death had seemed arbitrary. The old and young died as expected, their bodies less able to fight the fever. But so did people in the prime of life, strong men and women who should have survived, and some of the frail and elderly lived against all expectation. Old Margaret, who had been sick with something or other for years, survived the plague without even catching it. Young Robert, the strongest man in the village, died in 3 days. We looked for patterns because patterns would suggest meaning. If the wicked died and the righteous lived, we could make sense of it. But the wicked and the righteous died in equal measure. If the careful died and the careless lived, we could understand cause and effect. But caution offered no protection. Some who isolated themselves died alone in their houses. Some who continued living normally somehow escaped infection. There was no pattern. That was the hardest truth to accept. It had been random, meaningless, arbitrary. Elena wrote about a conversation she had with an old scholar who lived in her town. He had survived, though his wife had not, and he had spent the months since her death reading everything he could find about plagues, ancient texts, medical treatises, historical accounts. He told Elena that this was not the first great plague, nor would it be the last. These disasters came in cycles, he said. Society would rebuild, populations would grow, cities would expand, and then, inevitably, another plague would come. The scholar spoke of the plague that had struck the Roman Empire centuries ago, killing millions. The society that emerged afterward was different, he said. The old certainties had collapsed. New religions had spread. The empire itself had transformed, become something its founders would not have recognized. We are living through such a transformation now, he told Elena. The world before is gone. What comes next we cannot yet see. Elena found this both frightening and strangely comforting. Frightening because it suggested that all they had lost was simply the price of historical change, their loved ones reduced to statistics in a larger pattern. Comforting because it meant this had happened before, and humanity had survived, had rebuilt, had continued. They were not alone in their suffering. They were part of a long, terrible tradition of loss and recovery. I thought about this idea often after reading Elena's letter. Our village felt like the only place in the world sometimes, our grief unique and overwhelming. But of course it was not. This was happening everywhere, in every village, every town, every city across the land. Millions of people, all experiencing the same losses, the same fears, the same slow, painful process of learning to live again. The isolation of the plague months had made it easy to forget we were part of something larger. Now, as communication resumed and travelers began moving again, stories reached us from distant places. The plague had been worse in the cities, we heard, much worse. In some places the dead had been so numerous they could not be buried properly. Mass graves had been dug outside city walls. Entire districts had been abandoned. A merchant who passed through our village told stories about the capital. He said that half the population had died, perhaps more. The streets had been full of corpses at the height of it. Cart drivers had gone through neighborhoods calling, "Bring out your dead," and bodies had been piled onto wagons like cordwood. The rich had fled to country estates, leaving the poor to suffer. When the rich returned months later, they found a city transformed. Their servants were gone. Their houses had been looted or occupied. The poor who remained were no longer willing to accept the old arrangements. There had been riots, the merchant said. Demands for higher wages, better conditions. The authorities had tried to suppress these movements, but they lacked the power they once had. Too many soldiers were dead. Too many officials had fled and not returned. The city was negotiating a new social order, and no one knew exactly what that would look like. Elena wrote about similar tensions in her town. Workers demanded wages that would have been unthinkable before. Servants refused positions unless conditions met their requirements. Apprentices walked away from masters who treated them poorly, knowing they could find other opportunities. The shortage of labor had shifted power in ways that made the wealthy uncomfortable and gave the poor a taste of bargaining strength they had never possessed. Her husband complained about the difficulty of finding reliable workers. He had to pay twice what he once did, and even then, people would leave for better offers. Elena sympathized with his frustration, but also understood the workers' position. Why should they accept low wages when they could demand more? Why should they be grateful for positions that barely allowed them to survive? The plague had taught everyone that life was precious and brief. Why waste it in circumstances that brought no satisfaction? These practical questions about wages and working conditions might have seemed mundane compared to the existential weight of mass death, but they occupied much of people's attention in the months after the plague. We had to live. We had to find ways to survive in this new economic landscape. The old rules had broken down, and new ones had not yet solidified. It was a time of negotiation, of testing boundaries, of seeing what was possible. In my village, we faced our own version of these challenges. The manor lord tried to insist that the survivors among his tenants take on additional land, maintaining the same rents as before, even though they would have to work twice as much land with no additional hands. The tenants refused. They met together, something they had rarely done before, and presented a unified response. They would work their traditional holdings and no more. If the lord wanted the additional land worked, he would have to negotiate new terms. The lord blustered and threatened, but his threats were empty. He could not evict everyone. He needed the tenants more than they needed him. In the end, he compromised. Lower rents on the additional land, fewer labor obligations. The tenants still grumbled that it was not enough, but it was more than they would have dared ask before the plague. The world had shifted, even in our small corner of it. Elena's letters describe similar scenes playing out across her region. Everywhere, the balance between labor and capital, between workers and owners, was being renegotiated, not through legislation or decree, but through thousands of small confrontations and compromises. The plague had created a labor shortage, and scarcity gave workers leverage. They used it. But the economic changes were only part of a larger transformation. Elena wrote about changes in how people related to each other, how they thought about community and obligation. Before the plague, social bonds had been strong but also rigid. People knew their place, knew their duties, knew what was expected. The plague had shattered those certainties. Families had been torn apart. Children had lost parents. Parents had lost children. Spouses had lost each other. These losses created gaps in the social fabric that could not simply be patched. Orphans needed care, but traditional family structures had broken down. Widows and widowers needed support, but the extended family networks that once provided it were decimated. New forms of family began to emerge. Unrelated survivors banded together, creating households that would have seemed scandalous before. A widow and widower married for companionship and practical support, neither young, neither romantic, but both needing someone to share the burden of daily life. Orphans were taken in by neighbors or distant relatives, or sometimes just people who had lost their own children and could not bear their empty houses. Elena and her husband took in 2 children, siblings whose parents had died. The children were not relatives, just neighbors' children, but there was no one else. The alternative was the church's orphanage, which was overwhelmed and offered little real care. So Elena, who had no children of her own, became a mother to 2 traumatized young people who barely spoke for the first month. She wrote about the difficulty of this new role. She did not know what she was doing. The children woke screaming from nightmares. They barely ate. They flinched from kindness as if expecting betrayal. But slowly, very slowly, they began to emerge from their grief. The boy, who was 8, started helping in the garden. The girl, who was 10, began asking questions about cooking. They were learning to live again, and Elena was learning to be the person they needed her to be. I admired my sister's courage in taking on this responsibility. I had not been so brave. There were orphans in my village too, and I had offered help, certainly, but I had not opened my home. I told myself I was not suited to care for children, that others were better positioned to take them in. But the truth was simpler and less flattering. I was afraid of the commitment, afraid of the pain if I grew to love them and then lost them, as so many had lost so much already. Elena did not judge me for this. Her letters were generous, understanding. Everyone processed grief differently, she wrote. Everyone had different capacities for what they could bear. Some people rebuilt by reaching outward, taking in others, filling their lives with new connections. Some people rebuilt by turning inward, healing their own wounds before they could help anyone else. Neither was wrong. but her letters also challenged me gently. She described the joy she found in small moments with the children. The first time the boy laughed at something. The first time the girl asked for help with a task, showing trust. These moments did not erase the pain of all that had been lost, but they coexisted with it. Life and grief occupied the same space, and that was simply how things were now. I began to think differently about my own situation. My house was empty except for me. I had lost my husband to the plague, and we had never had children. The silence in my house was profound. I had been thinking of it as a protected space, a place where I could grieve without the demands of others. But perhaps it was also a trap. Perhaps the silence was keeping me stuck. There was a girl in the village, about 14, who had lost everyone. Her name was Beth. She had been living with an elderly aunt who tolerated her but did not particularly like her. I had noticed Beth around the village, always alone, always watchful. One day I approached her and asked if she would like to help me with some work in my garden. She agreed warily. She came the next day and worked hard, barely speaking. I paid her a small amount and asked if she would come back. She did. For weeks this pattern continued. She would come, work, accept payment, and leave with minimal conversation. But gradually she began to stay a bit longer, to accept a cup of water or a piece of bread, to answer questions with more than one word. I wrote to Elena about this. I was not taking Beth into my household, I said, but I was helping her, and she was helping me. The garden had become too much for me to manage alone. Her young strength made tasks easier, and her presence made the house feel less empty. Elena wrote back with encouragement. This was good, she said. I was finding my way, as everyone had to find theirs. The world would not return to what it was. We could not resurrect the dead or restore what had been destroyed, but we could build something new from what remained. Different, yes. Sadder, perhaps, but also possibly better in some ways. Better seemed like a strange word to use about a world after plague. But Elena explained what she meant. Before the plague, she had been comfortable but also constrained. Her life had followed a predictable path. Wife of a merchant, manager of a household, member of a community where everyone knew their place. It had been fine, but also limiting. She had never questioned whether there were other possibilities. Now, with so much broken and remade, she found herself questioning everything. Did she want to simply recreate what had been lost? Or could she imagine something different? The children she had taken in were not the children she would have born, but they needed her, and she needed them, and together they were creating a family that looked nothing like traditional families, but was nonetheless real. The same was true in larger ways. Her town would not return to its former order because that order had depended on structures and people that no longer existed. The new order emerging was more fluid, more negotiable. This was frightening, but also liberating. Perhaps they could build something better than what they had lost. More just, more flexible, more humane. I was not sure I shared Elena's optimism. The changes I saw in my village did not all seem positive. Yes, workers had more leverage, but conflicts over wages and obligations had created tensions. Yes, new families were forming, but many people remained isolated and alone. Yes, the old hierarchies had weakened, but nothing stable had replaced them. We seemed to be in a state of constant negotiation, and it was exhausting. But I also saw what Elena was describing. Young Catherine, who had saved her siblings during the plague, was now helping several other families in the village. She had a gift for nursing, people said. She was calm in crises, kind without being sentimental. She had begun taking on more and more of these responsibilities, and people had begun paying her for her help. She was becoming something like a village healer, a role she had created for herself out of necessity and skill. Before the plague, this would not have been possible. Catherine came from a poor family. She had no education. She was female and young. All of these factors would have prevented her from assuming such a role. But the plague had killed most of the people who might have objected, and the survivors needed her skills too much to care about propriety. She was helping, and that was enough. Elena wrote about similar stories in her town. A former servant who now ran a successful bakery. A young man who had started a hauling business with a cart and horse left behind by his dead employer. A woman who organized other women to petition the town council for a well in their district. These were small enterprises, small victories, but they added up to something. A world where opportunity was determined more by ability and need than by birth and tradition. Of course, not all the changes were positive. Eleanor also wrote about the darker aspects of life after plague, the men who had taken advantage of chaos to settle old scores, the properties seized through fraud or force, the women left vulnerable without male protectors, some of whom had been coerced into marriages they did not want. The plague had broken the old order, but not all of what replaced it was better. There was also the fear. Even as life normalized, fear lingered. Every cough made people nervous. Every fever sparked panic. Would it return? Could it return? Some people insisted the plague was over, that the worst had passed. Others were certain it would come back, that this was merely a reprieve. No one knew. Doctors and scholars speculated, but their explanations were contradictory. Some said it was punishment from God, which meant it could return if people did not reform. Some said it was caused by bad air, which meant it could recur if the air turned bad again. Some said it was contagion passed from person to person, which meant it could spread again if anyone carried it. In my village, we took precautions that had become habitual. We still stood farther apart than we once had. We still washed our hands obsessively. We still avoided strangers who might carry sickness from other places. These habits were probably excessive, months after the last case, but no one wanted to take risks. We had seen what the plague could do. We would not invite it back through carelessness. Elena described similar behaviors in her town. Markets operated differently now. People did not crowd together as they once had. Vendors and customers maintained distance. Money was often left in baskets rather than passed hand to hand. Some people wore cloth over their faces, believing it offered protection. These practices gave everyone a strange appearance, masked and distant, but they had become normal. The children Elena had taken in were frightened by crowds. They did not remember the plague clearly, being so young, but they remembered the fear. They remembered adults in panic, people dying, the world falling apart. Now they clung to Elena in public spaces, overwhelmed by noise and activity that would once have seemed ordinary. She was patient with them, but it worried her. How would they learn to live normally if they remained so traumatized? A priest she spoke with suggested that the children represented everyone, in a way. They were all traumatized. They had all lived through something that had shattered their understanding of how the world worked. The children were simply more honest about their fear. Adults had learned to hide it better, to function despite it. But the fear was there, shaping behavior, influencing decisions. Elena found this insight useful. If everyone was traumatized, then everyone needed patience and grace, both for themselves and others. People were not returning to their pre-plague selves because those selves had died along with everything else. They were becoming new selves, selves shaped by survival and loss. This process took time. It could not be rushed. I thought about my own transformation as I read Elena's letters. I had been a different person before the plague, more confident perhaps, more certain about how the world worked. I had believed in order, in stability, in the permanence of social structures that now seemed fragile and temporary. The plague had stripped away those illusions. In their place I had gained, what? Not wisdom exactly, more like a clear-eyed acceptance of uncertainty. I knew now that everything could change, that safety was temporary, that nothing was guaranteed. This knowledge was uncomfortable, but also strangely freeing. If nothing was guaranteed, then I could stop pretending to control things I could not control. I could focus on what was possible. Small kindnesses, daily work, connections with the people around me. Beth, the girl who helped in my garden, had become a regular presence. She still did not talk much, but she was there, and that mattered. We worked side by side in comfortable silence. Sometimes she would ask a question about plants or techniques. Sometimes I would tell her a story about my husband, or my childhood, or some memory from before. She listened carefully, absorbing these fragments of life before plague. One day she asked me about my husband, how he had died, whether he had suffered. I told her the truth. He had suffered. The fever had been terrible. But at the end, he had been peaceful. He had known I was there. He had not been alone. These details mattered to her. I could see her filing them away, adding them to her understanding of death, of grief, of how to survive loss. In return, she told me about her family. Her parents, both dead within days of each other. Her 2 brothers, who had died before them. Her baby sister, the last to go. She had nursed them all, just 14 years old, trying to do what the adults had done when her grandmother had been sick years before. But it had not been enough. Nothing had been enough. We cried together that day, in my garden, surrounded by vegetables that needed tending. 2 survivors sharing grief, acknowledging the impossible weight of what we had lived through. After that, something changed between us. We were not just employer and worker, not just 2 people in a village. We were connected by our survival, by our losses, by our determination to keep living even when living was hard. Elena's next letter arrived in early spring, almost a year after the plague had passed through her town. She wrote about the changing landscape, both literal and metaphorical. Fields that had lain fallow were being planted again. Abandoned houses were being occupied. The market was growing, new stalls appearing each week. Life was returning, though it looked different than before. She also wrote about a decision she and her husband had made. They were leaving, not permanently, but for a time. He wanted to expand his trading routes, explore new markets in regions less affected by the plague. She wanted to visit me, to see her old home, to reconnect with the parts of her life that the plague had disconnected. They would bring the children, make it an adventure, a journey towards something rather than just away from past pain. I was thrilled at the prospect of seeing her. It had been more than 2 years since we had been together in person. The thought of her arrival, of having my sister in my house, of not being alone, filled me with joy I had not felt in months. I began preparing immediately, cleaning rooms that had not been used, airing out bedding, planning meals, small tasks that gave purpose to my days. Beth helped with the preparations. She seemed almost as excited as I was, though she tried to hide it. The idea of new people, a larger household, even temporarily, appealed to her. She had been alone too long, I realized. She needed family, or something like it. Perhaps Elena's visit would help her see what was possible. The weeks before Elena's arrival passed slowly. I worked in the garden with Beth. I wrote letters to Elena, full of small details about village life, questions about her journey, excitement about her coming. I attended the weekly gatherings in the village, which had become a regular feature of community life. These meetings had evolved from the informal circles after Johann's funeral into something more structured. People shared news, discussed common problems, made decisions about village matters that once would have been dictated by the manor lord or the church. At one of these gatherings, someone raised the question of how to honor the dead. It had been a year since the worst of the plague. Should there be a memorial? A marker of some kind? A ceremony? The discussion was long and sometimes painful. Some people wanted to move forward, to stop dwelling on loss. Others felt that forgetting would be a betrayal of those who had died. We reached a compromise. A memorial stone would be placed in the church courtyard, inscribed with the names of the dead we could remember. There were many names, too many for the stone we could afford, but we would include as many as possible. And we would hold a service, not of mourning exactly, but of remembrance, an acknowledgement of what we had lived through and lost. The stone was carved and placed. The list of names was long. We stood before it on a gray spring day and read the names aloud. Every person in the village participated, each reading a few names, passing the duty from one to another. It took nearly an hour to read all of them. When we finished, the priest offered a prayer, but it was brief. We had our own remembering to do, our own private acknowledgments of absence. I read my husband's name. Beth read her family's names, her voice barely above a whisper. Others read parents, children, siblings, friends. The cumulative weight of those names, spoken aloud, was overwhelming. We had survived. but so many had not. The village would continue, but it would carry this loss forward. These names and faces and stories that would gradually fade as memory faded, but which for now were vivid and real. Elena arrived 3 days after the memorial service. I saw her coming up the road with her husband and the 2 children, their cart loaded with belongings. I had not seen her in person in so long that I barely recognized her at first. She looked older, thinner, her face marked by the year of suffering. But when she smiled, she was my sister again, familiar and beloved. We embraced carefully at first, then more tightly. We both wept. There were no words adequate for the moment, so we did not try to find them. We simply held each other, 2 survivors of catastrophe, together again after so much time and distance. The children hung back, uncertain. Beth watched from the doorway of my house, equally uncertain. Elena's husband began unloading the cart, giving us space for our reunion. Eventually we separated, wiped our eyes, and turned to the practical matters of arrival. Where would everyone sleep? What did they need? When had they last eaten? The house that had been so empty suddenly felt full. Children's voices echoed in rooms that had been silent. Meals became crowded, noisy affairs instead of solitary, quiet moments. It was overwhelming at first, but also wonderful. I had not realized how lonely I had been until the loneliness was interrupted. Elena and I stayed up late that first night, talking after everyone else had gone to bed. We covered the year in our letters, but being together allowed for different conversations, more intimate, more honest. She told me about the days she had not written about, the ones where she had barely been able to function, where grief had been so heavy she could not get out of bed. She told me about her marriage, which had been strained by loss and trauma, and which was still being rebuilt, piece by careful piece. I told her about my own dark days, the weeks where Beth had been my only human contact, the nights where I had considered ending my own pain, the slow, grudging return to something like stability. We compared notes on survival, on what had helped, on what had hindered. We were honest in ways we could not be in letters, which might be read by others or lost or judged. What emerged from that conversation was a map of grief's territory. We had both traveled through it by different paths, but we recognized the landmarks. The initial shock and numbness, the rage that came later, the bargaining with God or fate or whatever power might be listening, the depression that settled in like winter, and finally, not acceptance exactly, but accommodation. The grief did not end, but it changed, became something we carried rather than something that carried us. The children, both hers and Beth, were dealing with their own versions of this journey. They were younger, more resilient in some ways, more damaged in others. They needed stability and patience and the presence of adults who could model how to live with loss. Elena and I talked about how to provide this, drawing on what we had learned from our own experiences. Beth and Elena's children began cautiously making friends. They were wary of each other at first, each protecting their own pain. But children are better at connecting than adults sometimes. Within days they were playing together, creating games and imaginary worlds that had nothing to do with plague or death. Their laughter was strange and wonderful to hear. Elena and I fell into a rhythm during her visit. Mornings we worked together, cooking and cleaning and managing the household that had grown so suddenly. Afternoons we often spent in the garden, which was thriving under Beth's care. Evenings we talked, sometimes about serious matters, sometimes about nothing in particular. Her husband went about his business, traveling to nearby towns to establish contacts and trade relationships, returning every few days with news and goods. One evening, Elena asked me what I planned to do now, not just tomorrow or next week, but in the longer term. Would I stay in this village? Would I remain alone? Would I consider remarrying? The questions were difficult. I had been focused on getting through each day. I had not thought much about the future because the future felt uncertain and frightening. But her questions pushed me to consider possibilities. I could stay here, continue as I was, building a quiet life with Beth and my garden and the weekly village gatherings. That would be acceptable. Or I could imagine something else. Perhaps I could travel with Elena when she returned, see other places, help her with the children and the business. Perhaps I could take Beth with me, give her opportunities she would not have in this small village. Or perhaps I could do something entirely different. Start some kind of enterprise. Use what I had learned about herbs and healing. Open my home to other orphans. There were options. The plague had destroyed much, but it had also created spaces where new possibilities could grow. I did not make any decisions during Elena's visit, but I began thinking differently. Before I had been surviving. Now perhaps I could start living again. Not the life I had planned, not the life that had been interrupted by plague, but a new life, shaped by who I had become through loss. The weeks of Elena's visit passed quickly, too quickly. The children grew more comfortable together. Beth began to smile more, to initiate conversations, to show personality that had been hidden behind her protective silence. Elena's children, who had been so traumatized, began to relax, to trust that this place was safe, that the adults around them would care for them. Elena and I talked about extending her visit, but practical matters intervened. Her husband needed to return to his business. Summer was coming, the busiest season for trade. They had to go. We set a date for their departure, and as it approached, we all became quieter, sadder, not wanting to acknowledge the coming separation. On their last evening, we held a small feast. Beth helped me cook, and we made far too much food, creating abundance as a counter to all the scarcity we had known. We ate and talked and eventually sang old songs that brought memories of times before the plague. The children fell asleep at the table, exhausted by excitement and emotion. Elena and I stayed up after everyone else had gone to bed. One last conversation before parting. We talked about what we would do. She would continue building her new family, helping her husband rebuild his business, creating a life that honored what had been lost while moving toward what might be possible. I would stay here at least for now, but with new openness to possibility. And we would write. We would continue the correspondence that had sustained us through the worst times. We also talked about the future in larger terms. What world would these children inherit? What would they remember of the plague? How would it shape them? Would they grow up stronger for having survived, or would they be forever marked by trauma? We did not know. We could only do our best to give them stability, love, tools for living in an uncertain world. Before we went to bed that night, Elena gave me a gift. It was a bound collection of all the letters we had exchanged, which she had saved and organized. "So we remember," she said. "So we have a record of what we lived through. Not for anyone else, necessarily, but for us." I was moved by this gesture. The letters were a chronicle of survival, a map of how two sisters had navigated catastrophe through words and connection. They contained pain and hope, despair and determination, all the complexity of life during and after plague. They were precious. The next morning, Elena and her family departed. We embraced again, promised to write, made vague plans for future visits. Then they were in their cart, heading down the road, and I was standing with Beth, waving until they disappeared from view. The house felt empty again after they left, but differently than before. It was empty of Elena's presence, but full of memories from her visit. The rooms where she had slept still carried signs of occupation. The garden showed evidence of the children's play. The house was not lifeless. It was simply waiting for the next phase of whatever came after. Beth and I returned to our routines, but they had shifted subtly. She began staying later in the evenings, sometimes eating supper with me, sometimes just sitting and talking. She was opening up more, sharing thoughts and observations. One evening she asked if she could stay permanently, not just as a worker but as part of the household. She'd been thinking about it during Elena's visit, seeing what a different kind of family could look like. I agreed immediately. I had been hoping she would ask. We made arrangements with her aunt, who was relieved to have one less mouth to feed. Beth moved her few belongings into my house, into the room that had been set up for Elena's children. She was nervous at first, uncertain of her place, but gradually she settled in. We became a family, the two of us. Not mother and daughter exactly, though I was old enough to be her mother. Something else. Two survivors who had chosen each other, who had decided to build something together from the wreckage of their losses. We worked out rules and routines. We negotiated responsibilities. We learned each other's moods and needs. The village watched this arrangement with interest but little judgment. Too much had changed for people to be rigid about propriety. If it worked for us, that was sufficient, and it did work. Beth thrived with stability and care. I thrived with purpose and companionship. We were good for each other. I continued writing to Elena. She wrote back regularly, her letters full of news about her family and business, questions about my life and Beth, reflections on the ongoing process of recovery. The correspondence continued to anchor me, a connection to the sister who understood what I had been through because she had been through it herself. In one letter, Elena wrote about a conversation she had had with the old scholar in her town. He told her that historians would write about this plague someday, would analyze its causes and effects, would fit it into larger patterns. But those histories would miss something essential, he said. They would miss the individual experiences, the millions of small stories of loss and survival that together made up the catastrophe. That was why the letters mattered, Elena wrote. They were a record not just of events but of experience, of how it felt to live through plague, of how survivors rebuilt, of the small victories and continuing struggles. Someday perhaps someone would read them and understand not just what happened, but what it was like. I thought about this as I continued our correspondence. I wrote more carefully after that, more aware that I was creating a record, not for myself alone, but for Beth, for Elena's children, for whoever might someday want to understand what we had lived through. I wrote about the practical matters, but also the emotional ones, the nightmares that still came sometimes, the moments of unexpected joy, the way grief would ambush me when I was not prepared, the slow process of learning to hope again. Beth began writing too. She had learned to write in a church school before the plague, though her skills were basic, but she wanted to record her own story, her own memories before they faded. I helped her, and together we created her account of the plague years. It was shorter than mine, less detailed, but in some ways more powerful. She described experiences I had not lived through, being utterly alone, watching everyone she loved die, surviving through luck and stubbornness and the help of occasional strangers. The seasons turned. Summer came, bringing heat and growth. Autumn followed with harvest. Winter arrived with cold and the old fear that plague might return with it. But it did not return. We stayed healthy. The village continued its slow recovery. New children were born. Young people married. Life asserted itself against death. Elena's letters continued to arrive, and I continued to write back. Our correspondence became less about the plague itself and more about what came after, the ongoing work of rebuilding, the challenges of raising traumatized children, the evolving social landscape as new norms replaced old ones, the small satisfactions of daily life. She wrote about her business expanding, her husband finding new markets, their household growing as they took in another orphan, a boy who had been living rough. She wrote about the children starting to heal, slowly, imperfectly, but noticeably. They still had nightmares. They still had moments of panic, but they also laughed more, played more, showed trust more easily. I wrote about Beth's transformation, how she had begun helping other families in the village, using skills she had learned from necessity during the plague. How she was respected now, valued for her competence and kindness. How she had grown from a traumatized girl into a capable young woman. How proud I was of her. I also wrote about my own healing. The grief had not disappeared, but it had changed texture. It was no longer the sharp, overwhelming pain of the early months. It had become something I could carry, something I had integrated into who I was. I was a survivor. I had lived through catastrophe. That experience had marked me, but it did not define me entirely. 2 years after the plague, Elena wrote with news she was pregnant. After years of trying, years of loss and medical consultation and prayer, she was finally expecting a child. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. What if she lost this child, as she had lost so much else? What if something went wrong? But also, what if everything went right? What if new life could come from so much death? I wrote back immediately with congratulations and support. I understood her fear, but I encouraged her to hope. The plague had taught us that nothing was guaranteed, but that also meant joy was possible, even likely. She should embrace this possibility, prepare for this child, trust that the future could hold good things. Her pregnancy progressed. She wrote about it in detail, the discomforts and the excitement, the way the children in her household responded to the news. They were cautiously optimistic, having learned not to count on anything, but also hopeful. A baby would mean renewal, would mean the family was growing rather than just recovering from loss. The baby was born in spring, healthy and strong. Elena's letter announcing the birth was full of wonder. She had a daughter, a small, perfect daughter, who had come into our world recovering from plague, but nevertheless worth living in. She named her Hope, which seemed both obvious and perfect. I cried when I read that letter. Tears of joy for my sister, for this new life, for the possibility of future that the baby represented. After so much loss, here was gain. After so much death, here was birth. The world continued. Life continued. Beth and I began planning a visit to meet the baby. It would be a long journey, but we could manage it. We wanted to see Elena, to meet her daughter, to witness this new chapter. We made arrangements, organized our household affairs, and set out in early summer. The journey took weeks. We traveled slowly, staying at inns and with families along the way, seeing the landscape of recovery stretching across regions. Every town and village showed signs of the plague and signs of rebuilding. The proportions varied. Some places had been devastated. Others had escaped relatively lightly, but all showed the dual marks of destruction and renewal. We talked as we traveled, Beth and I, about what we had been through, about what we hoped for, about the future that seemed more possible now than it had in the dark months. She was thinking about marriage, she told me. There was a young man in our village who had shown interest. She was not sure yet, but she was considering it. The idea of creating a family, of choosing hope, appealed to her. I encouraged her to take her time, to make sure, but also not to let fear prevent her from living. The plague had taught us that tomorrow was not guaranteed, but that also meant we should make the most of today. If this young man was good and kind and she cared for him, that was worth pursuing. When we finally arrived at Elena's town, she was waiting for us. She looked different again, softer somehow, happiness evident in her face. The baby was in her arms, tiny and perfect, sleeping peacefully. I held my niece carefully, marveling at her small perfection, at the miracle of new life. Elena's household had grown. The 2 children she had taken in were older now, more settled. The new boy she had mentioned in her letters was there, still rough around the edges, but part of the family. Her husband looked older but content. They had built something real from the ruins of plague. We stayed for a month, Beth and I, long enough to be part of the household, to help with the baby, to reconnect with Elena in ways that letters could not accomplish, long enough to see what was possible when people chose to rebuild rather than surrender to despair. During our visit, Elena and I talked about writing something together, a full account of our experiences, drawn from our letters and memories, not just for ourselves or our families, but for anyone who might want to understand what survival looked like, what recovery required. The historian had been right that official records would miss the individual experience. We could provide that. We began organizing our letters, comparing our memories, creating a structure for the narrative. It would take time, we knew, maybe years, but we had time now. The immediate crisis had passed. We were survivors working to make sense of survival, to honor what had been lost while celebrating what remained. Beth met a girl in Elena's town, someone her age who had also lost family to plague. They became friends quickly, recognizing kinship in shared experience. They talked about their losses and their hopes. They made plans to correspond after we returned home. Beth was building her own network of connection, her own map of survival and recovery. As our visit drew toward its end, Elena and I talked about what had changed and what had remained constant. The world was different. Social structures had shifted. Economic relationships had been renegotiated. Many people had died and could never be replaced. But some things continued. Family, even when it took new forms. Community, even when it required rebuilding. Hope, even when it had to be chosen deliberately rather than assumed naturally. We packed our belongings and prepared to return home. The goodbye was sad but not devastating. We would write. We would visit again. The distance between us was manageable now that the roads were open and communication was reliable. We were separated by geography, but connected by experience and love, and the ongoing project of making sense of what we had survived. The journey home was different from the journey to Elena's town. Beth and I were quieter, more reflective. We had seen what recovery could look like when people committed to it fully. We had witnessed new life emerging from devastating loss. We carried these images home with us, gifts from Elena's household to ours. When we arrived back at our village, it felt smaller than I remembered, but also more precious. This was home. These people were my community. Whatever the future held, we would face it together as we had faced the plague. Not perfectly, not without conflict or difficulty, but together. Beth began planning her wedding. The young man she had mentioned during our journey proposed shortly after our return. She accepted. I helped her prepare, grateful to be part of this moment of joy and hope. The wedding was simple but joyful, the whole village attending, celebrating not just a marriage but the possibility of future. I continued writing to Elena. She wrote back with updates about hope, about the other children, about her ongoing work organizing the accounts we would write together. Our correspondence had evolved from lifeline to collaborative project to simple pleasure. We wrote because we wanted to, because we had things to say to each other, because the connection mattered. The letters themselves had changed. Earlier letters had been heavy with grief and trauma, full of attempts to process the overwhelming losses. Recent letters were lighter, more focused on daily life, on small joys and ordinary challenges. We were not forgetting the plague, but we were not defined solely by it either. We were people who had survived catastrophe, but we were also people living ongoing lives with ongoing concerns. Beth gave birth to a daughter the following spring, the cycle of life continuing. She named the baby Elena, after my sister, which moved me to tears. Another hope, another sign that the future was worth believing in. I became a grandmother of sorts, helping care for this new life, watching Beth transform into a mother. The village continued its recovery. We had rebuilt much of what had been lost, not perfectly, not in the exact form it had taken before, but rebuilt nonetheless. We had a functioning community, stable if not prosperous. We had created new traditions to replace ones that had died with their practitioners. We were different people in a different world, but we were managing. Elena's letters brought news of her region's continued recovery. Trade had improved. Population was slowly growing again through births and immigration. The economic disruptions had mostly settled into new patterns. Life went on as it always did, finding ways to continue even after catastrophe. In one of her letters, Elena reflected on what we had learned. The plague had taught us, she wrote, that security was an illusion, that change was constant, that loss was inevitable. These were hard lessons, painful lessons, but they had also taught us resilience, that humans could survive almost anything, that community could be rebuilt, that joy was possible even after profound suffering. She was right. We had learned these lessons through terrible experience. The cost had been enormous, but we had survived, and our survival meant something. We were witnesses to catastrophe and recovery. We were proof that life continued, that hope could be chosen, that the future was worth building even when the present was difficult. Years passed. Elena's daughter grew. Beth's daughter grew. More children were born. The generation that remembered the plague gradually aged, and a new generation emerged that knew it only through stories. The sharp edge of grief dulled with time, though it never disappeared entirely. Elena and I finished our written account of the plague years. It was long, detailed, honest. We included our letters, our memories, our reflections. We didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but that was not the point. We had created a record of experience, a testament to survival. a map for others who might face similar catastrophes. We were old women now, Elena and I, survivors of plague, yes, but also survivors of life's ordinary challenges. We had loved and lost. We had raised children, though not the ones we had expected to raise. We had built lives from the ruins of our previous lives. We had chosen hope when despair would have been easier. Our correspondence continued. We wrote until the end, until Elena's hand grew too unsteady to write clearly, until my eyes grew too dim to read easily. Then Beth read Elena's letters to me, and her children wrote my responses. The connection continued, adapted to new limitations, but constant. Elena died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family, in a house full of the noise and chaos of grandchildren. Beth wrote to tell me, and I grieved my sister one final time. But it was a different grief than the grief I had felt during the plague. This was natural loss, expected loss, the kind of loss that came at the end of a long, full life. It hurt, but it was bearable. I am old myself now. Writing these final words, adding them to the account Elena and I created together. The plague years are far behind me, but they shaped everything that came after. I am who I am because I survived, because I chose again and again to keep living even when living was hard, because I found connection with my sister, with Beth, with the community that rebuilt itself around me. To those who might read this someday, if anyone does, we survived. That is the essential fact. We lost much, suffered greatly, but we survived. And from survival we built new lives, different lives, lives marked by loss but not defined solely by it. We chose hope when we could. We chose connection. We chose to believe that tomorrow might be better than today, even when we had no guarantee it would be. The letters from survivors, like the ones my sister and I wrote, tell this story. Not of triumph exactly, not of easy recovery or simple healing, but of persistence, of resilience, of the human capacity to endure and adapt and continue. We lived through plague, and we live beyond it. That is our testimony. That is what we leave behind.